Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another webinar at the National Library of Scotland. My name is Kenny Redpath, and I'm the Events Officer at the Library. This evening, I'm delighted to be introducing Professor Fiona Sampson, who is here tonight to talk about her new book, Two-Way Mirror, The Life of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Now, Fiona has one heck of a CV. Not only is she a leading poet and writer, published in 30 languages, her 27 books include 8 poetry collections, and of course the critically acclaimed In Search of Mary Shelley. Broadcaster, critic, literary translator, she is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and of the Wordsworth Trust, and a trustee of the Royal Literary Fund. Her honours include an MBE for services to literature, multiple awards from the Arts Council of England and Wales, Society of Authors, Poetry Book Society, and Arts and Humanities Research Council. She has received international awards in the US, India, North Macedonia, Albania, and Bosnia. And currently she is at work on a book about the Romantics' rural legacy. I'm tired just reading that. I don't know how you all packed that in, Fiona. Now, I know we're in for a real treat tonight, but before handing over to Fiona, can I just say that there will be time for questions at the end of the webinar. So get thinking and type your questions into the Q&A function, and we'll do our very best to get through as many as we can. But for now, I'm delighted to say over to you, Fiona.
Thank you so much, Kenny, and thank you, Joe, and all the team. It's a pleasure to be back with the National Library of Scotland. And it's also a pleasure to be talking about Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who is my latest obsession and object, I suppose, of advocacy. I've got a slideshow, which I'm now going to move into, so bear with me while I turn everything around. There we go. So, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the making of a pioneering poet. And that's a little shot of the book. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's best-selling verse novel, Aurora Leigh, about how a woman becomes a poet, starts with the tempting suggestion that the self on the page mirrors the self who writes that page. It goes, "Of writing many books there is no end, and I who have written much in prose and verse for others' uses will write now for mine, will write my story for my better self, as when you paint your portrait for a friend who keeps it in a drawer and looks at it long after he has ceased to love you, just to hold together what he was and is." This is a thread I spent the last 3 years following towards Elizabeth Barrett Browning, that canonical figure who, to my astonishment, hasn't had a full-length biography since 1988. This is my favourite portrait of her. She liked to style herself EBB, by the way. In this image of EBB, she simultaneously turns away and looks back over her shoulder at us. In one sense, of course, every historical figure does this, glancing over their shoulder towards the future where we're watching them, even while they face away from us into their own time. But Barrett Browning makes the gesture particularly provocative. Her wide, sensual mouth dips and rises in a curly bracket. Sceptical, even teasing, her gaze has a directness that seems startlingly modern. Which is an irony, since it's an image that has been constructed by thoroughly old-fashioned means. The frontispiece for the 4th British edition of her best-selling verse novel, Aurora Leigh, is an engraving after an ambrotype taken specifically for this purpose. On the afternoon in September 1858, when a shutter falls on the poet's half-smile in a stuffy studio on Le Havre harbourfront, Photography is understood to be neither artistic nor detailed enough for portraiture. It will be another half dozen years before Julia Margaret Cameron starts to produce her famous, markedly pre-Raphaelite images of friends and family. And so the portrait that eventually results from that sitting won't be created by the photographer, but by a founder member of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood itself, Dante Gabriele Rossetti, who is a friend of EBB and of her husband and fellow poet, Robert Browning. But his are not the only hands her image passes through. First, it's engraved by a less stellar craftsman called Thomas Oldham Barlow. As the artist edits the result, notes and sketches sprawl over Rossetti's offprint. He instructs his engraver to be faithful to the photograph portrait, as they call it, that they're working from. For example, removing, quotes, a sort of smile not in the photograph and not characteristic of the original. And he's had plenty of chances to study this original at the Brownings' home, which he calls an evening resort where I never feel unhappy. In the 2 years since the highly successful appearance of Aurora Leigh, Elizabeth's pioneering 9-book Bildungsroman, which is the first to tell the story of a woman becoming a writer, his initial impressions, quote, as unattractive a person as can well be imagined, she looks quite worn out with illness and speaks in the tone of an invalid, have turned to admiring protectiveness. Now he replaces the photographer's stock studio furniture with a symbolic writing desk and instructs Barlow to darken the subject's hair and enlarge her signature dark eyes in order to make her a little younger and less worn out with illness. After all, this portrait's whole purpose is to extinguish what her husband calls certain horrible libels on humanity published as portraits of her in America. This obviously is not the same photographic portrait, but it's from the same sitting, the same afternoon. So earlier, shipping a copy of the original photograph itself to Aurora Leigh's American publishers, Robert Browning had assured them, just a shade too urgently, that, quotes, what you receive is the sun's simple truth without a hair's breadth of retouching. Well, up from Italy to spend the summer with Elizabeth's English family, the Brownings have picked out Le Havre as a halfway meeting point. And on the very last day of what turns out to be 2 unsatisfactory and tiring months at the Normandy port, Robert has found a clever man, as he calls him, to conduct the photographic session with his camera-shy wife. Jean-Victor Macaire-Warneau and his brother Louis Cyrus Macaire, who share the waterfront studio, are renowned technical pioneers. Yet the image that briefly saw commercial distribution in North America is oddly unclear, and the publishers, C.S. Francis and Co., don't use it. Look closer, though, and for all Robert's insistence that there isn't a hair's breadth of retouching, it turns out to have been clumsily overpainted. Forgive me slightly frustratingly for not including it in our slideshow, but that's for copyright reasons. It is in the book. In fact, within 2 sentences, Robert contradicts himself, remarking that Macaire-Warneau has worked up detail that got lost in the reproductive process. But who, apart from Robert, who was a keen amateur artist, could have made this correction, which is so clearly and clumsily carried out? We can't be absolutely sure we've caught him red-handed, but what we do know is that, luckily, he's kept back an untouched original. And it's this version that Barlow and Rossetti use, and in it we see the unexpurgated Elizabeth Barrett Browning with her dark eyes, her arched dark eyebrows, her long nose, and her upper lip with its sexy overbite. Her face is asymmetric. Cover the right side and the left seems soulful and focused. Cover the left and the right appears amused. You can see that in the engraving too. If I go back a slide. In the 21st century, we recognise instantly the Brownings' anxiety about this key publicity shot, and their need to control the image of the international celebrity that 52-year-old Elizabeth Barrett Browning has become by 1858. The irony is that, despite being so anxiously aware of the ramifications of image making, she is destined to become a notorious object lesson in how images of famous individuals get distorted. The Brownings would have been astonished and mortified to see myths about their private life obscure first her work and eventually even her identity. Elizabeth Barrett Browning is a pivotal literary and cultural figure, changing the direction of English language poetry and influencing both her contemporaries and subsequent generations of poets and readers. She also exerted real socio-political clout, and her ethical poetics, a new development, changed debates about child labour, rape and the trafficking of women, Italian independence, and the American abolition of slavery. Still today, I think, acknowledged as Britain's greatest ever woman poet, she is the author of one of the most famous and much quoted poems in our language, How Do I Love Thee? Let Me Count the Ways. When she died, she was mourned as a political heroine in revolutionary Italy. Yet, within 70 years of her death, popular culture would reduce her to a swooning poetess into whose little couch-bound life only a tyrannical father and an ardent poet-lover brought drama. And this actually is a cast of Elizabeth and Robert's clasped hands, kind of consolidating that myth. And this is a house in Wimpole Street, though not the one that the Barretts lived in. For the damage to Elizabeth's reputation was done above all by Rudolph Bézier's 1931 Broadway hit, The Barretts of Wimpole Street, which was followed by 3 film versions, a Norma Shearer and Charles Laughton vehicle in 1934, a 1957 remake with Jennifer Jones and John Gielgud, and the 1982 TV movie with Jane Lapotaire and Joss Ackland. There were also 7 made-for-TV versions beyond that. In these successive remakes of Bézier's domestic melodrama, the actors playing Elizabeth's father tellingly share star billing with the poet herself. So by the 1970s, when Saul Bellow, Philip Roth and John Updike crowded the book charts, the roaring boys of North American literary criticism would go a stage further, maligning Elizabeth Barrett Browning as relevant to the history of literature only through marriage, or worse, as hindering that real writer, her husband. In 1973's Oxford Anthology of English Literature, handsome paired volumes described as an authoritative student resource, which actually are just behind me on the shelf over my shoulder, the editors Lionel Trilling and Harold Bloom pronounce, quotes, Miss Barrett became an invalid, for still mysterious reasons, from 1838 to 1846, when she eloped with the best poet of the age. Her long home, Aurora Leigh, was much admired even by Ruskin, but is very bad. Quite bad, too, are the famous sonnets from the Portuguese. Though the Brownings' married life was reasonably happy, Mrs. Browning's enthusiasms gave her husband much grief. Possibly the tendentiousness of this is unsurprising. The anthology's editors print just 1 minor poem by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, but then the only other writing by women to feature in its more than 4,500 pages comprises 1 minor poem each by Edith Sitwell and Stevie Smith, 2 by Emily Bronte, and passages from Dorothy Wordsworth's diaries. In total, fewer than 24 pages, or around 0.5% of their canon. Incidentally, the same percent which applied to alcohol counts as alcohol-free. Excluded also are all of the Bronte's novels, Jane Austen, Mary Shelley, George Eliot, Virginia Woolf, and very many more. Literary revisionism on this scale is strenuous stuff. And within the continual process of reputation making and remaking that is literary history, Elizabeth Barrett Browning has remained a bellwether for the rising and sinking stock of women writers. It's probably no coincidence that the melodramatic exploitation of her life story came to an end in the 1980s as women's writing became more widely read, rediscovered, and even taught. Half a century earlier, when The Barretts of Wimpole Street was already a cultural phenomenon, Virginia Woolf, who saw the play, summed up the poet's then standing, quotes, "Passionate lovers in curls and side whiskers, oppressed, defiant, eloping. In this guise, thousands of people must know and love the Brownings who have never read a line of their poetry. But fate has not been kind to Mrs. Browning as a writer. Nobody reads her, nobody discusses her, nobody troubles to put her in her place." And Woolf, of course, was herself complicit in this. Her own version of EBB, Flush, a biography, is written from the reductive perspective of Elizabeth's pet spaniel. And although this is a second impression of the first edition, in other words, actually published by Leonard and Virginia Woolf, well, you can see at the Hogarth Press, this is not a photograph of Flush. This is a photograph of a much later Cocker Spaniel, a 1930s Spaniel. Nevertheless, Elizabeth's life dramatizes the two-way creation of every writing self, from without and from within. That the life of the body both enables and limits the life of the mind is the paradox of the thinking self, after all. John Keats's early death, or the 17-year-old poet's suicide in Henry Wallace's The Death of Chatterton, are moving because they remind us how a dead poet falls silent. But life imposes its own limits on the writer too. For every Lord Byron or Malcolm Lowry seizing the day in ways that their work celebrates, there's a John Clare or a Primo Levi trying to write experience away. We could, I think, see writers' bodies as creating a kind of resistance, forcing interplay between the self and the world. Elizabeth Barrett Browning turned 12 in 1818, the year that Frankenstein's creature first found out how deeply what happens to a body changes its wearer. And perhaps it's no accident that he's a creation of another woman writer. It used to be a feminist truism that René Descartes had it wrong, and there is no separation between mind and body. Yet bodies do disguise, shield, or isolate our minds. The woman the scaffolders whistle at may well be mulling, pioneering research. To spend any time with someone whose body is failing is to understand that recognizing the unimpaired selfhood within is both human and humane. So, do we inhabit the body in ways that are inseparable from how we think and feel? Or are we ghosts in a curvaceous machine, to borrow from the formulation of the 20th century British language philosopher Gilbert Ryle? Today, the virtual world seems to offer us the experience of ourselves as pure will without the resistances of the concrete world. And if we turn back 2 centuries, we find Elizabeth herself using the written word in virtual ways to take part in the wider world while remaining bodily at home on her daybed. For in doing so, she was transcending chronic illness, disability, gender, lack of education, as well as her beliefs that she was BAME. In the event, the thinking self that speaks in Elizabeth's work has triumphantly outlived her. But how telling it is that the fictionalized character of Elizabeth, that's replaced her in our popular imagination, is almost entirely bodily, scarcely a mind at all. The actual facts of her life are more interesting than the melodrama. She was born in County Durham in 1806, the first of what would eventually be 12 children, and in 1809, her father bought Hope End in Herefordshire, where he spent a fortune building a new mansion in the Orientalist style. There followed an idyllic childhood. The Barrett siblings were close, and Elizabeth's talent was recognised early by her parents, who preserved and even published her juvenilia. However, with adolescence came the onset of the ill health that was to define much of the rest of her life. And when she was 15, she spent a year away from home at Gloucester Spa Hotel, confined to a spinal sling. This was the start of a pattern of poor diagnosis and treatment, which led to an adult life of chronically disabling, often life-threatening lung disease. It also introduced the laudanum, to which she would be addicted for the rest of her life. And here's Gloucester Spa. Though Elizabeth's mother, Mary Barrett Moulton Barrett, died in 1828 when Elizabeth was 22, her own status as an invalid confined to her room released her from the domestic responsibilities that would normally have fallen to the eldest daughter. She was able to devote herself to her largely self-taught intellectual development, especially a fierce pursuit of excellence in translating Greek verse and in her own poetry. From the outside, these years can seem somewhat featureless, but at the same time, a contested will relating to her father's inheritance was forcing family retrenchment. Her mid-20s coincided with a period of intense anxiety. The possibility of having to live on the family's estates in Jamaica was mooted. So was the related likelihood that the family themselves were partly of African Caribbean heritage, something which in that era would have transformed their life chances. Elizabeth internalized the racism of her time and would later confide only once that she believed she had the cursed blood of a slave. And this anxiety about her background was perfectly realistic because she had first cousins who were of mixed heritage and also uncles and aunts. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any direct vertical ancestors who were BAME, because it would have been wonderful to find that this pioneering writer, woman writer, was also a pioneering BAME writer. Deeply embroiled in her emerging writer psyche was the paradox that the family money came from plantations and so from slavery. And yet she was an ardent abolitionist and advocate of human rights. In 1832, when she was 26, Hope End was sold and the family moved first to Sidmouth and then to London. The next years were a period of consolidation for Elizabeth, who began to develop friendships. This is the Sidmouth Terrace where she lived. The friendships were brokered by family friends, and they were formed with writers and editors and artists. She'd stepped into the professional literary world. A productive life, even if it had to be lived carefully indoors, seemed possible for the first time. But the years from 32 to 35 were a period of frustration and loss. Two of Elizabeth's brothers died, including her favourite, her kind of best friend and running mate, the eldest, called Bro, whose name was Edward. She spent 3 years in lonely exile in Torquay, fighting chronic pulmonary illness. In fact, forgive me, this is her home in Torquay. The benefits of sea air were slow to materialise, and by 1840, the grieving Elizabeth believed she was dying. Still, in 1838, her father had acquired 50 Wimpole Street, and it was here that she rejoined her family the following year, though she would actually live at the address famously associated with her for a total of fewer than 6 years. The poet had her own bed sitting room there, from which she rarely stirred, but her resulting output was so substantial that when William Wordsworth died in 1850, she became the first woman to be nominated for Poet Laureate. It would take 159 more years for a woman to actually be appointed, of course, and in the event, the honour went to Alfred Tennyson. Elizabeth's poem, The Cry of the Children, published in Blackwood's magazine in 1843, was instrumental in the campaign to abolish child labour. Her Poems 1844 made her one of Britain's most widely read writers at a time when poetry had a mass readership, as literacy spread and the new middle classes emerged. At a time when many women writers, including Jane Austen, Mary Shelley, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot, had felt compelled to write under male pseudonyms or anonymously, Elizabeth published under her own name. And one of her newfound admirers, after reading Poems 1844, was a fellow poet, Robert Browning. This is 50 Wimpole Street now because it was bombed in the war. 6 years Elizabeth's junior, and only modestly successful at the time, Robert nevertheless had a number of distinguished literary friends, including Thomas Carlyle and Walter Savage Landor, and he had an accurate appreciation of the importance of Elizabeth's work. He began a correspondence and eventually a year-long courtship that culminated in September 1846 in a secret marriage. A week after their marriage, the couple ran away together to Europe. Elizabeth was 40 by this stage and an established literary figure, but she was also her father's favourite, the frail and gifted eldest child. By now, he, and his name was Edward Barrett Moulton Barrett, was a widower of uncertain social standing. He lacked extended family in Britain, and at the same time he was empowered by the paternalism of the newly ascendant congregational Christianity in which he took an enormous interest. And for all these reasons, he seems to have been unable to let any of his children marry. He disowned all the three who did in his lifetime. Elizabeth was the first. She was followed by her next sister, Henrietta, and then by one of her brothers, Henry. From Europe, Elizabeth declared in letters home that Robert was, quote, perfect in all respects, and she underlined all. But true love is nothing without the material means for it to happen. And Elizabeth was especially lucky in being financially independent of her father, thanks to personal legacies. And this lack of independence was not only typical for her time, but it was what kept her siblings enslaved to him, as she put it herself. By October of 1846, the Brownings had arrived in Italy, where they would settle for the rest of Elizabeth's life. After an idyll in a hotel in Pisa, they moved to Florence the following spring, and after a few months, and with a certain amount of toing and froing, found themselves a home on the Piano Nobile of Palazzo Guidi, which Elizabeth came to call Casa Guidi. And Palazzo Guidi, Casa Guidi is the church is on the left of the picture for me. I'm not sure if it's reversed for you, but it's on the left in real life. And Casa Guidi is on the right, the first floor. You can just see the balcony rail in front of those sort of French windows onto. It's a very narrow balcony, but Elizabeth and Robert used to pace up and down there in the evenings when Elizabeth didn't feel well enough to go down into the street or didn't fancy doing so. 1848 was a time of optimism in Florence. It was the moment of La Giovane Italia and of hopes for an independent Italian republic. In this happy mood and also busy homemaking, Elizabeth fell pregnant for what was already a third time, and at the age of 43, gave birth to her son, Pennini, named for Robert's mother. Over the following years, both poets undertook striking creative developments, and during the 1850s, they also made repeated journeys, both back to Britain to see their families and, primarily for Elizabeth's health, to various Italian summer resorts and in the winters, south to Rome. Elizabeth flourished, and she proved herself, so to speak, intellectually warm-blooded. She'd always enjoyed literary life, even vicariously. She'd loved literary gossip. And in Italy, her improved health allowed her to socialise with many of the key writers and artists of her day. She became a kind of saloniste in a way. Among them were figures as varied as Hans Christian Andersen, Thomas Carlyle, and Georges Sand. She embraced the Italian political situation, most influentially in Casa Guidi Windows. And here's the setting, of course, which was published in 1851. In 1848, she published The Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point in the anti-slavery US magazine Liberty Bell. Her sequence of 44 sonnets for the Portuguese, first published in 1850 under the title intended to disguise their personal nature, had been written secretly about Robert during the lovers' courtship. Even Robert didn't know they existed. And in 1856, Elizabeth published the hugely influential Aurora Leigh, which was also an immediate bestseller. Hers was in many ways a model life, but even so much happiness must have its unhappy ending, it seems. By 1859, Elizabeth was once again increasingly unwell, flirting morbidly with spiritualism until her hope even in that ran out. She died in June 1861 at the age of 55 at home in Florence. Today, the apartment in Casa Guidi is open as a museum, its furnishings painstakingly recollected or reconstructed so it appears as the Brownings left it. For example, that mirror above the red sofa is the very mirror which appears in Robert's The Ring and the Book, describing it. It's the very mirror in which, you know, Elizabeth used to check her hair of a morning. And this is the room she died in. The couple shared the aesthetic tastes of their day, as you can see. Their friend, John Ruskin, published the 2 volumes of Modern Painters in 1843 and 1846, and his highly influential The 7 Lamps of Architecture appeared in 1849 after he'd undertaken a series of tours of Italy. So you can see that the Brownings were living an original that would soon be copied across Britain by Augustus Pugin and his imitators. Small wonder, perhaps, that when Elizabeth died in Casa Guidi in her husband's arms on June the 29th, 1861, her last word, as recorded by him, was beautiful. But hers isn't a story about art or life as just beauty, but as willpower. She called herself EBB as a child, and you can see that EBB is what she's called on her sepulchre too. When EBB emerges as a child prodigy and declares not only that she will be a poet, but that she already is one, it should be a reach too far. In 1806, the year of her birth, women can neither vote nor, in England at least, own property once married. Even the wealthiest receive little formal education and are barred from all but the oldest profession. On marriage, they pass from their father's control to their husbands without becoming citizens in their own right. So it's not surprising that at the start of the 19th century, women writers tend to emerge in the company of literary men who've brought them along too, so to speak, whether by accident or design. The exceptional talents of Maria Edgeworth, of Mary Shelley and the Bronte sisters were all first recognised by educated intellectual fathers. Elizabeth's father too, although no litterateur, encourages his young daughter. Perhaps she owes her conspicuous confidence to him. Quotes, "Literature was the star which in prospect illuminated my future days. It was the spur which prompted me, the aim, the very soul of my being," she asserts, at 14. Born 9 years after Mary Shelley and 10 before Charlotte Bronte, she starts writing as a child of 6 and doesn't stop until 5 weeks before she dies. Her first surviving poem, titled On the Cruelty of Forcement to Man, about press gangs, is written in the Herefordshire country house of her childhood. Her last, called The North and the South, almost 4 decades later in Rome in May 1861, the month before her death. So what of this link between the poet and her poetry? We started with Aurora Leigh, the masterpiece Elizabeth publishes at 50, in which the fictional poet Elizabeth has invented writes a poetic masterpiece we never get to read. But we do get to read how she feels about it, about her commitment to poetry. As she says to her doubting cousin, quotes, "I may love my art. You'll grant that even a woman may love art, seeing that to waste true love on anything is womanly, past question." Rhetoric, which sounds like an own goal, but is in fact strategic. For lacking both social agency and an education in the classical arts of logic and rhetoric that father or husband have received, a woman born at the start of the 19th century is unlikely to win arguments by reasoning about who or what she is. She must learn instead to be stubborn, irrational even. To claim that she too is a poet, she must arm herself with her own weakness, which is to say her enthusiasm. Quotes, "I lived those days and wrote because I lived, unlicensed else. My heart beat in my brain." Elizabeth's own success will be indubitable, the kind poets dream of and rarely achieve. Aurora Leigh, with which she crowns that success, will be an instant bestseller, its first edition selling out within a fortnight, and go on to be one of the best read literary works of the second half of the 19th century. When it appeared, form-expanding romantic biographies and memoirs by men, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions or William Godwin's memoirs of his wife, known as the author of The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, have long been in print, while Charlotte Bronte lists, quotes, Lives of the Poets, Boswell's Life of Johnson, Southey's Life of Nelson, Lockhart's Life of Burns, Moore's Life of Sheridan, Moore's Life of Byron, Woolf's Remains. But this is the first woman's Künstlerroman, the story specifically of a woman maker's development, written by a woman, and it will influence generations of poets and writers. Among the many for whom it's immediately formative are George Eliot, Charlotte Mew, the writing duo who make up Michael Field, and Emily Dickinson, who hangs that Rossetti portrait in her own room. But its success isn't limited by gender. Leading male writers, among them Rudyard Kipling, John Ruskin, Swinburne, and Wilde, will celebrate the work over the coming decades. Aurora Leigh is a work of fiction whose 9 books map only indirectly onto its author's own life. But it does portray the development of a woman poet. Thus, on her 20th birthday, the poem's protagonist, orphaned Aurora, refuses a marriage both loving and advantageous in order to dedicate herself to writing poetry. Just before she does so, she crowns herself with a poet's wreath. Quotes, "What, therefore, if I crown myself today in sport, not pride, to learn the feel of it?" To learn the feel of it. Is she delayed until she or the world felt confident that she deserved poetic laurels? How long would Aurora or Elizabeth have to wait? In fact, laurel wreaths will crown Barrett Browning's coffin for her civic funeral in Florence. But meanwhile, at 13, in the preface to her first printed work, The Battle of Marathon, Elizabeth says, "Happily, it is not now as it was in the days of Pope. Now, even the female may drive her Pegasus through the realms of Parnassus without being saluted with the most equivocal of all appellations, a learned lady, without being celebrated by her friends as a Sappho or traduced by her critics as a pedant, without being abused in the review or criticised in society." Unfortunately, the reception of her work, even today, shows this isn't always true. Yet Aurora, Elizabeth, has her eye on the prize. She, quotes, "never can be satisfied with the comparative respect, which means the absolute scorn." For what matters to her isn't producing tolerable verse, but being a true poet, judged by the highest standards, rather than the prejudiced reviewing she experienced, and which she satirizes in Aurora Leigh. Quotes, "Among our female authors, we make room for this fair writer and congratulate the country that produces in these times such women competent to, ellipsis, spell." Elizabeth Barrett Browning is not Aurora Leigh, but popular and critical reception is a kind of mirror, even a distorting one, as her life story shows us. And literary biography is a kind of mirror too. It's always a Bildungsroman, the adventure story of how the thinking self emerges. And in this sense, the story Elizabeth Barrett Browning tells in Aurora Leigh is the one her life story tells us too. I'm going to leave you with the cover image and hand back with thanks to Kenny.